Jim Big Rig Donovan had been driving trucks for over 20 years, but he had never seen anything like this. The roads at night were his domain, familiar and quiet, but something felt different tonight. The sky was a deep, starless black, and the truck's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled on the highway. He wiped his brow, feeling uneasy for reasons he couldn't quite explain. The CB radio crackled with static before a voice came through, heavy with tension. "Big Rig, you there?" It was Bob, another trucker Jim had known for years. "I'm here, Bob. What's up?" Jim replied, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. "Something ain't right out here. You better keep your eyes peeled," Bob warned, his voice low. "I've been on this stretch of road for hours, and it feels wrong, like I'm being watched. I don't know, man, but I don't like it." Trying to shake off the unease that had crept into his own chest. "You're just tired, old buddy. The road does that to you after a while. Why don't you pull over and take a break?" Bob didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "I can't stop now. Not after what I saw." There was a long pause. "I've been driving these roads for 30 years, Jim. I know when something's off. There's something out there. Something. Watching. You'll see it too if you keep GGOing." Jim felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't want to admit it. Truckers weren't supposed to be scared. They were supposed to be tough, seasoned, unshakable. But Bob wasn't one to joke around. He was serious. "Bob, you sure you're all right?" Jim asked, his voice more concerned now. The truck's tires hummed steadily on the asphalt as he picked up speed, heading further down the empty highway. There was no answer. The line went dead. The hours passed. Jim's eyes grew heavy, but he fought the sleep. He wasn't a rookie, and he knew that driving tired was a one-way ticket to disaster. The headlights of the truck illuminated the road ahead, cutting through the darkness, but it felt like the night was stretching on forever. His mind wandered, recalling Bob's words about being watched. He shook his head, brushing the thought away. He'd driven countless miles in his career. There was nothing out here to fear. But the air felt heavier now, thick and oppressive. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each mile. Jim adjusted the air conditioning to clear the mist from the windows, but it did little to help. The road was as empty as it had always been, but the silence was unsettling. The hum of the engine, the faint hiss of the tires on wet asphalt, and the low buzz of the radio were the only sounds. His eyes drifted to the side mirrors, scanning the dark void behind him, but there was nothing. No headlights, no taillights, just the endless black. He pressed the accelerator harder, trying to push the anxiety out of his mind. A few more miles and he'd be at the next rest stop. Maybe he'd catch up with Bob and make sure the old man was okay. And then he saw it. A figure on the side of the road, standing still in the middle of nowhere. At first, Jim thought it was a trick of the fog, a shadow cast by the trees. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. A tall man, dressed in a worn, tattered coat. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He stood perfectly still, as if he were waiting for Jim. Jim's heart skipped a beat. He hit the brakes instinctively, slowing the truck as he approached the figure. The man didn't move, not an inch. It was like he wasn't even aware of the truck coming at him. Jim swerved to avoid him, his tires screeching on the damp road and his heart pounding in his chest. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. It wasn't possible. He hadn't imagined it. He had seen that man, standing there, motionless, staring at him. Jim slammed his hand on the CB radio, his voice shaking now. "Bob, you there?" No answer. "Bob?" Jim repeated, more urgently now. Still nothing. Jim cursed under his breath and tried calling out to Bob again, but the radio was dead. The fog seemed to thicken again, swirling around him like a living thing. His pulse raced as his grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something far worse than just an old man on the side of the road. The road stretched on, an endless ribbon of asphalt, but it felt different now. The more Jim drove, the more it seemed as though the world around him was slipping away. The fog was so thick that he couldn't even see the edge of the road anymore. He felt disoriented, like he was driving in a dream. Then, the radio crackled again, a strange, garbled voice cutting through the static. "Jim, you there?" It was Bob. Jim's heart leaped in his chest. "Bob, where the hell have you been?" I thought you were gone." I'm still here, Jim." Bob's voice was strained, filled with a kind of panic that Jim had never heard from him before. "But you need to stop. Don't keep going. Turn back. It's not safe out there. Trust." Jim's mind raced. "What are you talking about? What happened?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Bob's voice came through again, weaker now. "It's the road. It's shut. Changing. The highway. It's not what you think. There's something on this route. Something old. It waits for drivers. Like us. I saw it. I saw what's out there, Jim. The radio went dead. Jim slammed his fist against the dashboard, his frustration bubbling over. He had to find Bob. Whatever was happening, he couldn't just leave him out here. He turned the wheel hard to the right, preparing to pull off onto the shoulder to find a safe place to stop, but the truck didn't respond. The wheel spun freely in his hands, as though the power steering had gone out. Panic gripped him as he fought to regain control. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, just like before. Only this time, it was much closer. Standing in the middle of the road, but this time, it wasn't a man. It was something much worse. Its body was tall and lanky, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. Its eyes were hollow black voids, and its mouth opened too wide, too unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jim's heart raced, and he slammed the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. The figure took a step forward. The lights flickered and went out. Everything went dark. When Jim awoke, he was no longer on the road. The truck was stopped. The engine was silent. The fog had cleared, and the air was strangely still. He sat up, disoriented, his head pounding as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The landscape around him was nothing like the highway he had been driving on just minutes before. In every direction, there were trees, dark, twisted trees that seemed to loom over him like silent sentinels. And the road. The road had vanished. In its place was an old, overgrown path, swallowed by the forest. The signs were gone. The familiar landmarks were missing. The world felt wrong. Jim fumbled with the door handle and stepped out of the truck. His boots crunched against the forest floor as he took a few hesitant steps. Everything was eerily quiet. No wind, no animals, no sounds of life at all. He realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, there was a figure emerging from the shadows of the trees. The tall, thin shape of a man, or something that had once been human, stepped forward. His eyes were empty, his face a mask of despair. It was Bob. But Bob wasn't right. His skin was stretched tight, and his body seemed to sway unnaturally, like a puppet with broken strings. Bob's voice was a rasp, barely audible. "You should have listened. Now, you're one of us." Jim's stomach churned as he took a step back. "Bob, what happened to you? What is this place?" But Bob didn't answer. Instead, he just kept walking toward Jim, his eyes empty and his smile wide. It was too late to escape, and Jim realized, with growing horror, that the road was never going to let him go. Jim's heart raced as Bob advanced, his footsteps slow but deliberate. The air felt thick with something unspoken, and the trees around them creaked as if they too were. "Bob, snap out of it. What's happened to you?" Jim's voice was shaky, but he tried to remain calm. He stepped back, but Bob kept moving toward him with that same eerie, unblinking stare. He reached for his truck keys in his pocket, his fingers trembling. His mind was a whirl of confusion. He had to get out of here. Whatever had happened to Bob, he didn't want to end up like him. The truck, the road, everything felt wrong, like he had crossed into some alternate version of reality where nothing made sense. "Bob, stop!" Jim shouted, his back against the side of the truck now. The world around him felt like it was closing in, and the sound of his own voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. His voice so distorted that it barely resembled the man Jim had known for years. "You'll understand soon. The road takes what it wants, all of us. We're just passing through." Jim didn't know what to say. The words didn't make sense. The fog, the shadowy figure, Bob's change. Nothing about this was natural. The truck. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was pulling him down. When he reached the door, he fumbled for the handle, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The truck door opened with a loud creak, and Jim jumped inside, slamming it shut behind him. He threw the key into the ignition and twisted. Nothing. The engine sputtered, but it didn't start. "Come on," he shouted, banging his fist against the dashboard. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps behind him made his blood run cold. He whipped around, but the truck's rearview mirror showed only the black forest beyond. He grabbed the CB radio, praying it would. "Bob, please. What's going on?" "What do you mean? The road takes what it wants." He pressed the button, but the radio crackled and hissed, offering only static in response. He turned to look out the windshield, and his breath caught in his throat. There, standing just past the edge of the trees, was another figure. It wasn't Bob this time. It was a woman. Her face was obscured by a dark veil of hair, but her outline was unmistakable, tall, slender, and unnaturally still. She stood motionless, staring at Jim through the fog, like she was waiting for him to make a move. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine. What the hell was happening? "Who are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His hand was still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the woman began to walk toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, her feet barely touching the ground. She moved like a specter, as if she was gliding rather than walking. Jim slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the truck jerked forward, screeching against the gravel. He had to get away. He couldn't stay here, not with whatever this was, whatever was stalking him. But as he tore down the path, he realized with growing horror that the road was changing again. The truck's headlights cut through the thick fog, but the road ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, winding through a forest that had become too dense, too unnaturally twisted. Jim glanced at the rearview mirror again, but the woman was gone. In fact, all traces of the forest had disappeared. He looked forward, and there it was, something that had not been there before. A sign. A crooked wooden post, splintered and weathered by time. The letters on the sign were faded, but Jim could just make them out. "Welcome to Eldor." The name didn't ring any bells. He had never seen this town before, and yet, somehow, the sign felt familiar, too familiar, as if he had seen it 100 times in his nightmares. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. This can't be real. This can't be happening. The road curved ahead, and Jim's stomach turned as he realized that the town sign seemed to get closer with every passing second, as if the road was pulling him toward it. Jim's breath grew shallow, his palms sweaty against the steering wheel. He glanced out the side window and saw what looked like old, dilapidated houses, a ghost town, abandoned and rotting. The truck crept forward. No matter how hard he pushed the pedal, it was like the road itself had locked him in, forcing him down a path he couldn't escape. "God, please," Jim whispered, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the front windshield. There was no sign of the woman anymore, but the fog seemed to thicken around him, suffocating, closing in like a noose. Suddenly, the truck lurched to a halt. Jim gasped and gripped the wheel tightly. The engine stopped. He tried to restart the truck, but it wouldn't turn over. His hands trembled. No, 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 no. He punched the dashboard in frustration, but there was no time for panic now. He needed to think. He had to get out of here. Through the fog, he saw the outline of the woman again. Only now, she wasn't alone. Figures, hundreds of them, emerged from the mist. People. Figures that were half human, half something else, with hollow eyes and stretched, unnatural features. Their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their skin gray and rotting, like they had been dead for decades. Jim's throat went dry. "Welcome to Eldoro, Jim," a voice called out, distant yet echoing in his mind. It was Bob's voice, but distorted, warped. "You'll fit in just fine." The fog closed in on the truck, thickening like a curtain, and Jim realized with growing horror that he was trapped. Jim couldn't see anymore. The fog had completely swallowed him. The figures outside were gone, and he was alone in the suffocating dark. But then, something changed. A soft, whispering voice floated through the cab of the truck. The voice was low, soothing, like a lullaby, but it held a darkness that sent shivers down Jim's spine. "Don't you see, Jim?" the voice cooed. "You've been driving this road for years. All of you have. You're a part of the road now. The road doesn't let you leave. You've always been a part of the road." Jim cold as realization dawned on him. The road. It had taken him. It had taken everyone before him. Bob, the woman, all of them. He wasn't just driving a truck. He was being driven. The world around him was changing again. The trees were no longer trees, but twisted figures, their limbs outstretched like hands reaching for him. The mist grew thick and viscous, like it was alive, crawling across the windshield in strange, ghostly shape. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A dark figure, standing in the middle of the road, waiting for him. The figure stepped forward, and Jim's breath caught in his throat. It was the same figure that had been watching him earlier, the one he had swerved to avoid. This time, there would be no escape. Jim slammed his foot on the gas again, but the truck didn't move. The figure stepped closer, and Jim understood. The road never lets you go. Jim Donovan had been driving trucks for almost 2 decades. He was used to the quiet, endless roads stretching before him, especially during the long, dark hours of the night. The open highway was his second home, the hum of the tires against the asphalt his constant companion. But tonight, something felt off. It was late, around 2 a.m., when Jim passed the small roadside diner, its neon open sign flickering in the distance. He had just left the truck stop after a quick cup of coffee, and he was on his way to deliver a load of supplies to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The fog had rolled in thicker than usual, swirling around his truck like a living thing, and the sky above seemed unnaturally dark, even for the middle of the night. Jim rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the sleepiness, but it wasn't the fatigue that bothered him. It was something else. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was like the road itself felt wrong. He reached for the CB radio. A crackle of static filled the air, followed by a "Hey, Big Rig, you there?" It was Bob, a fellow trucker Jim had known for years. Jim smiled and flicked the switch to respond. "I'm here, Bob. What? You feeling it too?" Bob's voice sounded strained, unlike his usual cheerful tone. "Something's off tonight. The road's giving me the creep." Jim chuckled softly, but it didn't feel right. He'd been driving these roads for long enough to know when things were a little strange, but still. He tried to reassure Bob. Come on, Bob. You're just tired. It's late, and that fog messes with your head. Keep your eyes on the road, and you'll be fine." Bob didn't respond immediately. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jim." Bob's voice came through again, much quieter this time. "I'm telling you, there's something on this road. I saw it last night, and now I feel it again. You better watch yourself." Jim frowned. Bob wasn't one to joke around. "What did you see?" Bob didn't answer right away. The static on the radio seemed to grow louder, and then suddenly, the line went dead. Jim glanced at the radio and shook his head. "Damn thing," he muttered. He tried calling out to Bob again, but there was nothing but static. The eerie feeling crept deeper into his chest. Something was wrong. He couldn't shake. Jim pressed on, the truck's headlights cutting through the thick fog. He wasn't far from the next town, where he'd take a quick break and check in with dispatch. The steady rhythm of the tires on the road was oddly comforting, but that feeling of unease lingered in the back of his mind. The further he went, the thicker the fog seemed to get. It wasn't just a light mist, it was dense, almost as if it was alive, swirling around him in twisting tendrils. The world beyond his headlights seemed to vanish into nothingness. And then, through the fog, he saw something ahead. A figure. A man, standing in the middle of the road. Jim's heart skipped a beat. He slammed his foot on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move. Jim's pulse raced as he stared at the strange man, who was dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows of the night. The man didn't wave or shout for help. He simply stood there, perfectly still, his back to the approach. Jim honked the horn, but the figure didn't budge. "What the hell?" Jim muttered to himself. He couldn't stop now. He was still on a tight schedule. But he couldn't risk hitting the man either. Slowly, Jim swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding the figure. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the man stepping aside or moving, but there was nothing. The road was empty again. Jim breathed a sigh of relief and turned his attention back to the fog ahead. But something wasn't right. He hadn't seen the man's face. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The feeling that something was following him grew stronger, suffocating him in the small cab of the truck. He tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just tired. But the longer he drove, the more it felt like the road itself was alive, twisting and shifting beneath him. Hours passed, and Jim found himself deep into the night. The fog had not cleared. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the road was as dark as ever. Jim felt his eyelids grow heavy. He hadn't had much sleep lately, but he pushed through, telling himself he'd take a break. He was about to reach the town where he would stop, but when he checked the map, he froze. The road wasn't on. Jim blinked and looked again, but the map was clear. It was the right route, but the road he was on didn't match any of the towns or highways he was supposed to pass. His stomach sank. The highway signs, he had passed several of them earlier, but they were all faded and unreadable. He had no idea where he was anymore. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by twisted dark trees and an eerie silence that pressed in on him from all sides. He reached for the CB again, hoping to catch Bob or someone else on the line. "Anyone out there?" he called, his voice tinged with frustration. "Bob? Anyone?" But there was only static. Jim gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles turning white. His heart was racing now. He had to be close to something, a town, a gas station, anything. But the more he drove, the more the road seemed to stretch out before him, with no end in sight. Hours turned into what felt like days. The road was endless, and the fog seemed to grow thicker with every mile. Suddenly, he saw it, a shape ahead, barely visible through the mist. A truck. It was parked at the side of the road, its lights off, but the engine was still running. Jim's breath caught in his throat. Whoever it was, they were just as stranded as he was. He pulled up beside the truck and honked, hoping for a response. But there was no movement. He rolled down his window, leaning out into the fog, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. "Hey, you all right?" he shouted. No answer. Jim's heart pounded as he reached for the door, his fingers trembling. Slowly, he stepped out of the truck and walked toward the other vehicle. It was an old rig, covered in dirt and grime, with a faded company logo on the side. As Jim got closer, he saw the driver's side door was open, but there was no one inside. The cab was empty. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Where had the driver gone? A sound behind him caught his attention. Jim whipped around. A figure, a man, standing in the fog, just like before. But this time, there was no mistaking the look on his face. The man was grinning. Jim's pulse surged, and his body went cold. He tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. The man's grin stretched unnaturally wide, his teeth yellow and jagged. "What do you want?" Jim shouted, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he began to move toward Jim, his steps slow and deliberate. Jim took a few steps back, but his legs were weak and his back pressed against the cold metal of his truck. "I'm just passing through," Jim said, trying to stay calm. "I don't want any trouble." But the man didn't stop. He kept walking closer, his grin never faded. Jim's heart raced. He couldn't stay here. He had to get away. He turned and scrambled back into his truck, slamming the door shut behind him. He tried to start the engine, but the truck sputtered, refusing to turn. The fog was thicker than ever now, and Jim could barely see past the windshield. He could still hear the man's footsteps, slow and steady, coming closer. Jim's mind screamed for him to get out of there. But the road was endless. There was nowhere to go. The fog swallowed everything, and he couldn't even see where the highway ended. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The footsteps, the fog, the road. Jim sat in the dark, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was trapped. The road had claimed him, just like it had claimed countless others before. And in the distance, he heard a voice. "You're one of us now." Jim's fingers trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, sweat dripping down his brow despite the cold air in the truck. He couldn't move, couldn't think straight. The fog outside was thick, almost suffocating, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see that grinning man standing right next to the truck again. But there was nothing, just the deep, unnatural stillness of the night. The engine sputtered again, and Jim tried to start it once more, but nothing happened. The truck was dead. His heart pounded in his chest as he slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "Come on, damn it," he muttered under his breath, but the engine refused to cooperate. There was a sound, a faint scratching. It came from the side of the truck, near the door. Jim froze, his blood running cold. It wasn't the wind, he knew that much. It was too deliberate, too methodical. Someone or something was outside. Slowly, almost in a trance, Jim reached for the door handle. He hesitated, the cold metal beneath his hand sending a shock of dread through his body. What was out there? Was it the man? Was it something worse? The scratching continued. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Taking a deep breath, Jim twisted the handle and flung the door open. Nothing. The fog billowed into the truck, thick and damp, but there was no sign of anyone, no grinning man, no footstep. Jim's mind raced. He didn't know what to think anymore. The road had changed. It was like a living thing, warping reality, pulling him deeper into some nightmare. And whatever had happened to Bob earlier, it wasn't just some coincidence. It was all connected. The figure in the road, the truck that had disappeared, the strange voices over the radio. Everything. Without thinking, Jim reached for the CB radio once again, hoping for a sign of life. Maybe another trucker had passed by, someone who could explain what was happening. He held down the button, his voice shaky as he called out, "Is anyone out there? I need help. I don't know where I am. The radio crackled to life, but it wasn't Bob's voice this time. His blood turned to ice. It was the same voice from before, but it was different now. A low, gravelly whisper that seemed to come from all directions, echoing in his ears. It wasn't just the CB radio. It was as if the voice was in the truck with Jim, you can't run from us. The voice was clear now, cold and mock. Wherever you go, the road will follow. You'll never leave, Jim. You're ours. Jim's stomach churned. He tried to respond, but his throat was dry, and his words stuck in his mouth. Who are you? He croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The voice didn't answer at first. There was only a long pause, a heavy silence pressing in around him. Then it returned, slower this time, almost patient. We are the road. We are the ones who never leave. You were always meant to be part of it. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating against the walls of the truck. Jim felt dizzy, the reality around him starting to distort. The fog seemed to stretch, swirling and twisting in unnatural patterns. The road, his road, was changing. Suddenly, the truck lurched, as if something heavy had slammed into it from the outside. Jim's eyes snapped open, and he looked around in panic, but there was nothing. The truck was still, silent, but he knew something had happened. He could feel it. The fog had thickened again, almost to the point of suffocation, and the air felt charged with some unseen force. Jim started the truck again, his hands shaking. This time the engine turned over, but it was rough, like the machine itself was struggling to move. He put it in gear, slowly pulling the truck forward. The road stretched on in front of him, as endless as it had been before, winding into the fog. And then he saw a sign, a wooden sign, cracked and old, standing by the side of the road. Welcome to... Jim slammed on the brakes, his heart skipping a beat. He had seen that name before. He wasn't sure when, but the memory stirred something deep in him. Eldor. The road wasn't just a road anymore. It was a place that Jim was trapped. He looked around, his mind racing. The fog was starting to clear slightly, revealing the faint outline of a town ahead. It was just a blur through the mist, but it was enough to make his pulse spike. There were buildings, tall structures, old ones, decaying and broken. The air felt heavier now, and the weight of something unseen pressed down on him. He had to stop. He couldn't keep going. Not with that voice in his head, not with this feeling of being hunted. But where could he go? He thought about the truck stop he had passed hours ago, the diner, the gas stations. None of them had seemed out of place at first, but now they felt so far away, like they were from another world. Was this the same road he had been on? Jim slowed the truck and pulled off to the side, near the faded sign. He needed to get out. He needed to think. Maybe he could figure out what was happening. Maybe someone in Eldoro could help him. Maybe he wasn't alone. He pulled the brakes on the truck, and the engine fell into a rumbling idle. The truck shuddered slightly, almost as if it were sighing with relief. When he stepped out into the thick fog, Jim noticed that the air was unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of the road, the hum of passing cars, the rustle of leaves were gone. There was no movement, no animals, no wind. It was as though the world itself had been paused, waiting. He stepped forward, walking cautiously toward the town. With every step he took, the fog seemed to grow thicker. His vision blurred, and the town's outline became less and less clear. The fog, it seemed, was pushing him toward the center of Eldoro, towards something he didn't fully understand. And then, as he approached the first building, Jim felt it. A presence. A coldness that seeped into his bones. The shadows seemed to move around him, watching him, following his every move. He glanced over his shoulder, but no one was there. Still, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was lurking just beyond the edge of his sight. He swallowed hard. He had to keep moving. He had no choice. But when he reached the center of the town, he stopped dead in his track. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. The same man. The grinning man. And he wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens. Hundreds. All of them standing still, watching him with their empty, lifeless eyes. "Welcome to Eldoro, Jim," the man said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. Jim tried to turn and run, but the road seemed to stretch out endlessly in every direction, the buildings closing in and the figures surrounding him. There was no escape. The fog closed in around him, and the figures began to move, slowly, deliberately. And Jim knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was never going to leave this place. The fog swallowed him whole. The last thing Jim saw before the darkness took him was the grinning man's face, his smile widening, stretching, until it was impossibly wide.